Welcome to a very special episode of the Reboot Recovery Show. So many of you have emailed questions or called in wanting to have us do a special episode on the subject of suicide. Well, to do that today, I have an incredibly special guest. Dr. Matthew Sleeth has just released his new book called Hope Always. He is an expert. In addition to being an emergency room physician, he is also a pastor with a heart for this specific topic. You are not going to want to miss this episode. Hey everybody, I'm Evan Owens with the Reboot Recovery Show, where we're overcoming trauma together and we're embracing a brighter future. Today we have Dr. Matthew Sleath with us. He's a new friend of mine who we've just been having conversations. I've been learning so much from him. And I know that today, as we get into this topic of suicide, we talk about how faith and suicide kind of interact with each other. I know this is a topic that a lot of you have either personally encountered through your own suicidal ideations or own attempts, or maybe someone who you love has. It's a topic that we address in all of our Reboot curriculums, but obviously we don't have an entire program or curriculum or book written just about suicide. So I went in, I got the ringer off the bench. Dr. Matthew Sleath is here with us. If you don't do anything else today, go and purchase his new book, Hope Always. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on almost any bookstore where it's being sold. So, Dr. Sleath, thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Great to be with you, Evan, and your listeners.
Yeah. So I guess first things first, you told me a story before we got on to this call. You were recently at the Wilberforce conference down in Dallas, or down in Texas, I think it was. Tell us what your experience was there a little bit, just to kind of set the stage for the environment when we start talking about faith and suicide. Give me that story again.
Well, I was given a great slot to speak in and given one of the larger slots of time. And they were announcing the afternoon speakers to the crowd there. It was a very sizable crowd. And when they said, and Matthew Sleath is going to talk about suicide, there was a groan that went through the whole audience. And so I got up and I said, just, imagine what it's like. And there had been a reception get-together just 2 nights before. And I said that the first person I talked to said, why are you here? And I said, I'm here to give a talk. And they said, what about? And I said, suicide. And they literally went, ooh, can we change the topic? I sat down next to somebody else and they same kind of thing. Why are you here? And I said, give a talk. What on? Suicide. And they went, ooh. And I changed the topic. So
Right.
It's something that, it's just hard for people. And I told people it's okay. God put me in a job as an ER doc and taught me how to give hard news. I once had to call somebody and say, I've got bad news and really bad news. The bad news is I've looked over your labs and you've got 48 hours to live. And they said, that's the bad news. What's the really bad news? I said, I couldn't get a hold of you yesterday. So
Wow.
It's a joke.
No, that's a good one. That's a good one. And our first responders will really appreciate the dark humor there. I love that. That's awesome.
But the point being that it's a topic that there's a reticence to talk about, and yet we've just got to do it. Satan, and I'm going to just use Satan loves darkness, and he loves to shame us into not talking about things, and that's just wrong. This is one we got to bring out in the light. We've got to bring all the things that God has to bear on it.
Wow. And so many people that I've talked to over the years, when I talk to them about their suicide attempt, or when I talk to them about the ideas they're having, I'm always constantly not surprised, but sometimes their reaction or their response after they've gotten through this period of sort of mental health crisis, after they've come out on the other side, I've asked them sometimes in a moment of clarity, sort of, what was kind of going through their head? Tell me a little bit about why this became such a viable option for you. Why did this become something that became attractive? And I guess let me ask that question. Why is it that so many people, what are some of the root causes that lead to so many people seeing suicide as a potential path, maybe to escape their pain or to for the pain to stop? Why is it that so many people end up there?
It's a great question, and there's no one answer to that. I mean, people commit suicide out of despair, out of loneliness, out of a wanting to escape pain, out of a wanting to escape the future, um, and when I look at it through a theologic lens, then I begin to get answers. And if you open up your Bible and right there on the first page, Adam and Eve were told that if you do this particular thing, it's going to kill you. Surely you will die. You're committing suicide. And not only did they do it, but there was somebody pushing them.
Wow.
And frankly, if you go through scripture and you look at every time the enemy, Satan, the accuser, whatever you want to call this adversary of humanity, comes along, he's trying to get somebody to kill themselves. That's what he's trying to do in the book of Job. Even when Satan meets Christ, one of his proposals is that Christ jump off a high tower.
Right.
And the thing that you got to step back away from that and then realize is that suicide is a uniquely human activity. There's no animal model for this, and scientists have looked for one. There's no kind of Koch's postulates you can fall back on. Suicide is distinctly human. There has never been a zebra that woke up one morning and said, to heck with it, today I'm not going to run from the lion. And so when you look at this, you want to bring all your scientific tools to bear, because all truth is God's truth, but you got to bring in the spiritual component to it, because that's also what's going on. It's a spiritual battle I think we're in.
Yeah. And it's so much more common. I remember growing up when I was a little boy in church. There was a lady at our church who asked the question during our Wednesday night Bible class. Some of the listeners might remember those, where they would get together as the whole church, kind of the subset of the church would get together. And the lady raised her hand in the very back row. Her husband was a leader within the church, right? She was a well-established sort of member. And I remember her raising her hand and asking the question, to the teacher, do you think that suicide is a sin? And this was one of the questions that she asked from the back of the room. And I remember instantly there was this sort of puzzled look on everybody's faces. Well, why is she asking this? What's going on, right? And it sort of created this hubbub in this room. And I remember that as a very little boy, because something in me kind of went off, and I was like, I need to pay attention to this answer. This is interesting, right? This is an interesting. This isn't just your standard, let's read through the book of Romans again. This was a question that was different, And I think a lot of people in the church assume, well, because Christians assume that it's a sin, they won't be tempted by it, and or they won't actually do it, right? Because they believe that if I take my life, I'll end up in hell, and I don't want to do that, so suicide's not a real option for the Christian. Why is that not true? Like, why is that something that's not necessarily true?
Okay. Well, there's kind of more than one concept there, so let me try to unpack it if I can.
Please.
First of all, since Durkheim, a sociologist, studied this in Europe about 120 years ago, it's been well known that Christians, or somebody who has a strong belief in God, are about 4 to 6 times less likely to take their life than an atheist. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that Christians or believers are immune to this.
Very good.
And as a matter of fact, the studies that have looked at this show that Christians think about it the exact same amount as a non-Christian. So one of the things that I did with Hope Always is to try to come at this from a different angle, because there are many, many books about why people commit suicide. I wanted to know why others in similar circumstances did not.
Oh, that's good.
And because, when it comes to the disease of suicide, prevention is the only acceptable medicine. That's it.
Right.
We've got to get out ahead of this. And so when I interviewed person after person who had attempted suicide or thought very seriously about it and then gotten past that, I said, what was it that got you beyond it? Why didn't you just go ahead and pull the trigger? And the number one answer was fear of the Lord. And to a non-believer, that might sound terrible, but in Scripture, fear of the Lord is the beginning of a very wonderful path, and it's called wisdom. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so that was the number one reason. And the number two was concern about how much it would hurt others. And so if those are two reasons that people have to stay alive and go on and get through really hard times, that's okay with me. That's all right.
I love that. This fear of the Lord concept is so strong, the beginning of wisdom, and wisdom would help, I assume, show us the way to be able to deal, right? Like what's that promise in 1 Corinthians when we're tempted, right? He'll give us a way out. I think it's 1 Corinthians maybe 7. I think that might be right. And my data, at least on my end, shows that of what I've spoke about or reported about before, shows that a suicide attempt happens about every 22 seconds in the United States, and that a life is lost about every 11 minutes. And that might be slightly out of date. You might have even more up to date, having just written a book on the subject.
Yeah, no, that's the same thing. But actually, I want to unpack that for a moment, because that is right now we're at 14 per 100,000 suicides in the United States, and suicides are measured per 100,000 as other health events and that sort of thing, so we can compare one population to another and even one time period to another. And if you look, the time when suicide was that high was during the aptly named Great Depression. But here's why 14 per 100,000 in 1930 and 14 per 100,000 now in 2021 doesn't really give the full picture. And that is that it's become a whole lot harder to kill yourself. In 1930, if somebody found you on the ground, how do they even call for an ambulance? Right. Less than 40% of the homes had phones in it. If they do call for an ambulance, there might not even be ambulances available. In lots of cities and towns, the hearses did bag and drag, it was called back then. If you got to a hospital, many hospitals didn't have emergency rooms. They certainly didn't have trained personnel, doctors, nurses, that sort of thing, trained in it. You couldn't find out what somebody overdosed on. Now you can find out within moments what somebody's overdosed on. And then pharmacologically, we can reverse a whole lot of those. So overdose on narcotics, you've got Narcan. Overdose on benzodiazepine, you have flumazenil. Overdose on digoxin, you got Digimon, and so on. And so the reality is that a much better measure of what's going on isn't the people dying by suicide, but the people being seen in emergency departments for it. So
that's fantastic.
The estimate is that during the coming year, 10 million people will contemplate ending their lives seriously, and of that, 1.5 million are going to end up being treated in an emergency department. And my guesstimate is that if we took that 1.5 million back to 1930 and only had 1930s technology to treat them with, we would see a suicide rate of 300 per 100,000. And so we're orders of magnitude worse than any other place that's ever been in history.
Wow.
So you are, you and your listeners are dealing with something the likes of which has never hit humanity, really.
Well, I've read some really interesting studies that show that over the past several years, for the first time in modern history in America, that the average lifespan is actually getting shorter. not
decreasing.
because not because we're dying at birth, and not because we're not living older. Those two actually are improving, but it's because we're dying in the middle due to opioid addiction, due to overdose, and due to suicide at such a rate that it's actually skewing the curve, right? It's actually skewing the data a little bit. Is that still true? And this, again, I'm a little rusty on some of this data stuff,
Nope,
so I'm looking to you to correct me.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true, and that's the other thing. In 1930, if somebody was found on the ground with a heroin syringe next to them and they were dead, most likely that would have been counted as a suicide. And we have taken all overdoses and separated them out. And so if you add deaths by overdose to suicide, you go up like 2.5 times the rate.
Right. And that's just where I was going. Exactly. You beat me to it. It's exactly right.
And just to get that into perspective for people, because these numbers, how do you really, everything's the biggest crisis on the news and that sort of thing. But for every murder you hear about in the news, for every murder in the United States, there's 2.5 times more suicides. And I think that gets it into perspective for people as well.
Yeah. And I think the part that's most heartbreaking for us, through our Reboot Recovery courses around the country, at churches, even in clinics, hospitals, wherever it may be, we see a broad age group, a broad gender base, a broad race base of people, very diverse groups of people. And it's interesting because the data shows that suicide among people, 18 to 39, something like that, is infinitely higher, right? That it's the second leading cause of death, I believe, below.
It's the second leading cause of death. Numbers wise, the most likely demographic to commit suicide is me. A picture of somebody like me. That's somebody 65 to 85 years old, white male. But the demographics are changing really rapidly. And to give you an example, you and I were talking before this. We started recording here, and I talking about my son, who's a physician, and he spends 2 months a year in the United States practicing medicine, pediatrics, and 10 months a year in Tenwick Hospital in Kenya. It's a really large missions hospital. And so when he's back here, he goes on faculty at University of Kentucky, and he practices. And he called me up after his first shift running the pediatrics ward, and he said, "Dad, you are absolutely onto something here. 1/3 of the inpatient population in pediatrics is there for suicide." And he said that used to be 5% just a couple of years ago. So the demographics are changing, and we're seeing more and more very young people try it.
Yeah, and it's sad. I mean, when we first started Reboot as an organization, we were late to the game, right? I mean, and our listeners, some of you know this, is that by the time we really got started, it was 2012, 2013. The war had been going on in America for more than 12 years. And by a lot of accounts, the operational tempo was starting to decline, the intensity. Now, some who listen might say there were some bad windows after that, and there were. But most of the casualties, things of that nature, had climbed. But what was interesting is what people didn't realize is it was about 2 years after the deployments really started slowing down that the suicide pandemic among veterans really started to climb. We saw just where our offices were at Fort Campbell, we saw them jump from just a few hundred to thousands of suicide attempts, right? And it was entire barracks bringing us in for briefings and this sort of thing. And this big data became a big point for veterans, right? It's 22 veterans a day who are completing suicide. And so we got kind of versed in the suicide language, really somewhat with our blinders on, not realizing that, yes, it was increasing among veterans, specifically young active duty military, right? Young people. But we had our blinders on, and we didn't really see how this wasn't just young military members. This was young people as a whole. And since we began to expand both into first responders and everybody else, we're seeing this where it's very common in a group of, say, 15 people for there to be 3, 4, 5 people under the age of 40 who have all had suicide attempts. And one of the questions that people always ask me on podcasts, and I never quite know how to answer it, so maybe you will have the answer for us today. They always say, why is it so common among young people today? Why is it that young people don't have the resilience or are struggling the way that they are? And they always kind of position it, especially if it's an older interviewer of me, they always ask, why is it so much more common? And I always kind of fumble around the answer. So I'm going to ask you the uncomfortable question. Why do you think it's so common among this younger population? Why is it skewing so rapidly?
It is a great question, and I think there's a few factors, but I think that we are seeing the results of society in general unmooring itself from the anchor of God. And that plays out at all kinds of levels. And, when I don't think anybody would seriously consider driving their 12-year-old to, the big city near them, going to the roughest part of that city, opening the door and saying, go have fun. But with the internet today, with the way we can get information, that's literally what's happening. And the bullying and the violence and that type of thing, and this isn't my guess, by the way, this is known information that the more time young people spend on social media and on the internet, the more likely they are to see suicide as an option.
Wow. Yeah, this topic is just so close to home for me.
And I think we have to discuss it whether we're comfortable with young people or not. As an example, I was here I'm based in Lexington, Kentucky, and there was a church group coming through town, had about 15 students, high school students, and I was asked, could I meet with them for a few hours? I said, yeah, not only that, but I'll supply the pizzas. I didn't realize how many pizzas that many high school students can consume. But so we met and we're talking and everything. And then finally somebody said, what are you writing? And this is when I was writing Hope Always. And I said, I'm working on a book about suicide. You just could have, the room just went still. And for teenagers to get still, something's going on. And it turned out they were traveling with a nurse because 2 of the students were on active suicide watch. And one of them, another student had just lost a first cousin that week to suicide. And I put a question to him. I said, has anybody in the church ever talked to you about suicide? And the answer was no. They hadn't heard it from the pulpit. They hadn't heard it from a youth leader, nothing. That kind of silence is a sermon. And yes. I think a lot of younger people are hearing, we don't care from right. My generation, your generation perhaps. And I think that we have to wade into it. That doesn't necessarily begin with a 6-year-old talking about suicide, but it begins with a 6-year-old saying, hey, God made you for a purpose. And you are loved, and I love you. And even in those times when you don't feel like it, that you're loved. And if you ever do have this thought, that thought is not your thought. That thought is coming from an evil place that wants to harm you.
That's right. That's so good. Wow. So good. Yeah, it's really interesting. You talk about that. I mean, Jenny and I, we talk about that with raising our boys all the time, that we recognize they are going to have some challenges for that, and we try to instill that in them. And I think a lot of our listeners, right, to them, just very practically telling their kids like that you matter and that God created you for a reason, and come what may, right, He still loves you. We always talk about that. Your best days aren't behind you. You're not just the sum of your worst set of actions over a short period of time, right? There's hope, and I love the title of the book. It's interesting. One of the things that I really feel like you're a kindred spirit in this. For many years, we've been out trying this crusade of trying to get the church to awaken to the subject of trauma. And it appears that over the past 12 months, 24 months, it seems like the conversation has shifted a little bit. It seems like we're starting to have a seat at the table where for many years, it was sort of seen a little bit like, why do we need to talk about that? Like you alluded to, right? That they had never heard a sermon on, they'd never heard a topic like this, right? And I think I've said it before on this podcast and others that I believe the greatest evangelical opportunity we have as Christians today is in the area of trauma and mental health and suicide and those types of topics. I believe that represents the greatest opportunity to engage culture in a way to say, hey, we're here, we're a lighthouse of hope, we're a shelter from the storm, we're a group of community that can be walls around you that you can lean against when times get hard. But that only happens if we know what to say and what not to say, right? So you've released a free PDF kind of little talking points that I want everybody to go download from your website first off, right? And tell us real quick, it's a PDF toolkit, right? And tell them a little bit about that toolkit and why that's a good thing for them to have.
Well, for most people, and that would include me before I had any training in this, bringing up the subject of suicide is just too big a hurdle to get over.
Right.
And one of the greatest concerns is that you're going to make the situation worse, or you're going to put it in somebody's mind who hasn't been thinking about suicide at all. And I
Right.
want to reassure people that has been studied ad nauseum, and
Correct.
you only decrease the rate of suicide by asking the question, because it shows that you care. And in
Yes.
my gut is that nobody wants to kill themselves. People want to be asked. They want to tell you what's going on. They want to share that burden with other people. So in that toolkit, there's literally, what's the first sentence you should say? What's the second? What's the
Yes.
third? And resources. And I think everybody should put in their phone, 1-800-273-TALK. That's the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. Having
Yes.
that in there just shows you care, and share the contact if you need to. And so there's all kinds of things like that, ways to encourage people that are dealing with depression, mental illness. And one of the things I want to make it really clear to the church is to remind them that in Jesus's healing ministry, and you got to remember, when John the Baptist sent people to Jesus to say, "Hey, are you the Messiah? Remind me, are you the guy that I baptized, and I heard this is my son in whom I'm well pleased?" Jesus said, "We've opened a hospital. The lame have got crutches now. The blind are being seen in ophthalmology. The deaf are being seen in ENT. We opened a hospital here." And that Jesus made absolutely no distinction between mental and physical illness. And actually to make that statement, which is a bold statement, is actually understating it. Because you have to remember, when Jesus went to deal with mental illness, the demoniac in Decapolis, it was a rabbi going to a stinking swine huge farm to do it. In other words, Jesus went out of his way to minister to those that were suffering with mental illness and trauma, as far as I can see. And so as a church, we're charged to do likewise. So the toolkit is, even if just things like send somebody a playlist of songs that lift you up or them up, or send snail mail, and because part of the mind of somebody who's contemplating suicide is that the world would be better off without me, and we need to deliver the message that's not true. And I think about the situation in Scripture where Paul and Silas have been jailed in Philippi, and they're in the stocks and everything. And around midnight, Paul preaches up a seismic event, and they have an earthquake, which is eventually what destroyed Philippi. And the stocks fall open, and the doors of the jail fall open, and the jailer believes that he's failed in his job, and he says, "I'm going to kill myself."
Kill myself, yep.
And Paul cries out, "We're all here." And for those people contemplating ending their life, what they need to hear from the church is, we're all here. We're here with you for this.
Well, if you're listening to this and that doesn't get you fired up to learn more, to grow more, check your pulse, because I think that's exactly the heartbeat of the mission, right? That's the heartbeat of the gospel, to say we're here. This idea that healing happens in the context of community that we talk about so much here. I mean, we even say where we're overcoming trauma together. I mean, that's the slogan, if you will, for this entire podcast. And I think that, one of the things that you articulated so much there is sometimes this idea that we feel like the world would be better off without us, and how untrue that is. And so I want to end this podcast actually with speaking directly to the person who might be listening today, who's went through a terrible or a tragic or a trauma in their life, a tragic event in their life, and suicide is creeping at the door. I think about, is it Deuteronomy? You're the pastor here. You should know this, where it says sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you. I think it's Cain and Abel, maybe, right? Is that maybe Genesis?
Yes, that's God talking about where's what happened to Abel here. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Cain and Abel. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So
See, I knew it was
because Cain. That's before Cain kills Abel. That's after they brought their offerings.
That's right. That's right. Sin is okay. It was in Genesis. I got it right. Second thought. It took me a minute there. Right. For some people, perhaps the temptation of suicide is crouching at their door. It desires to have them. So I guess two pieces to kind of close on. What would you say to them right now, to our listeners who might be feeling that, and what's the best practical step they can take?
Yeah, I would say that is your enemy and not your friend. That's whispering that in your voice, and that you need to do everything so that you're not dealing with this alone. You whether you need to be on medicines, counselor, you need to not go this alone. You need to get help, and it's no shame to ask for help. It's a sign of strength.
Yeah,
there's countless examples in the Bible, whether it was Moses, Elijah, David, who got to the end of the rope and they cried out to the Lord, and they got help.
That is so beautiful. We're here to help. You can always go to our website, rebootrecovery.com, or if it's a more acute emergency situation, obviously you can call 911 or call a national suicide hotline or something of that nature, because there's nothing more important than your safety at this moment, right? No amount of knowledge, nothing we can say on this podcast can get you the level of help that you need, obviously, but we hope that we can remove some of the shame that you might feel because of.
Don't leave this movie before the final act here. God has a plan for you.
Yes, and I just want to encourage you that if you're walking through a hard time with someone who has dealt with suicide, continue to be in their life, continue to encourage them, continue to tell them that they matter, continue to point them towards a brighter future, remind them of whose they are and who they are in Jesus, even if they don't know it yet. And in my experience, I've had, unfortunately, several close friends who have survived suicide attempts, and in my experience, it's usually been those relationships that pull them through. It's the idea that there is at least one person who loves me and cares about me, and that's important. That's important. And so again, go to Amazon, go to wherever it is, buy the new book, buy it today, right away. It's called Hope Always. It's by Dr. Matthew Sleeth. You can also learn more at Matthew Sleeth, MD, and that's spelled Matthew, Sleeth, MD. So MatthewSleethMD.com. You can click right there on Hope Always. Not to mention, he's also written a series of other books, one of which I am going to go and learn more about because the title is awesome, called Restoring Faith: What Trees Teach Us About the Nature of God and His Love for Us. So I'm going to go get that one and learn more about that myself. He's written other books, 24/6. He's written one called Serve God, Save the Planet. He's also one of the developers of a thing called, is it the Green Bible? Is that what it's
Green
called,
Bible.
I believe?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, Green Bible. Yep. And if you see him out somewhere, don't ask him to sign the Bible, because that's just weird, asking someone to sign a Bible. You can ask him to sign just the devotional. How about that? There. See, I saved you a little bit on that from having to sign the Gospel of John as if it was your own. Again, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. We are so grateful. We love you. We care about you as a listener. Even if we don't know you personally, I want you to know that God does have a plan for your life. And although, you may still look backwards and have a painful past you can't erase, you still have the pen in your hand. You can still write your future. Don't give that over to an enemy who would have your story end on their terms versus on yours. Again, keep moving forward together as we overcome trauma. I'm Evan Owens. This is the Reboot Recovery Show.